Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are continuing again for a final week, the 7 principles of making marriage work. We're going to cover principles 5, 6, and 7, and principles 5 and 6 we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on. We'll touch on them and we'll talk about them, but they correlate very closely with conflict resolution, which is an episode we just did early in February. So it's been like a month and a half. So, we'll kind of talk about the highlights and maybe the way John Gottman talks about them, but we're going to spend most of our time in Principle 7. And of course, you can go ahead and listen to the episode on conflict resolution to get our take on solving problems, because that's really what conflict resolution is about and really what John Gottman is talking about here. So let's start with talking about the 2 types of conflict that Gottman talks about in his book.
So in his research, he divides them into solvable and non-solvable problems. Now, he used to say, and I can't find it in the book, but I've heard him enough say that he thinks a third of marital problems are not solvable.
Interesting.
So, which seems to me like a lot.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, I wonder if in his research, what happens is he's getting couples where they have these problems that are recurring, or they're perpetual. He calls them perpetual problems. And I wonder if they just haven't been able to find the solution to them.
Yeah.
And so, I think he does great research, but I just question this idea because in looking in this chapter through the examples of what he has as, perpetual problems, I really disagree with it. Okay. I think that a lot of them fall into the category of solvable problems. And so, for instance, I'll just pick one out. And again, I have an older version, so this may not correspond. So here's one that he thinks is a perpetual problem. Ingrid wishes that Gary would bring up things that are bothering him rather than sulking. But when he does try to tell her when he's upset by something she's done, she gets critical about he has brought them up. She asks him not to mention so many at the same time. So he would say that somehow that's part of their personality or, the makeup that they bring to the marriage. And I disagree because I deal with problems just like that every day. Mm-hmm. And I think when we get married, when we meet someone, you don't know them completely. There's no way that you can. Actually, I think that's part of the great thing about marriage is you get to know this person, over the course of your marriage. And we've talked about curiosity. If you maintain that curiosity, it can be a great journey. Mm-hmm. So, and I've said this before in our episodes that I think it takes about 5 to 10 years to be married to really figure out what that means, because you have 2 people, they're coming from different families of origin. And so there are going to be different ways that you approach problems. That doesn't mean that they're not solvable. They are not perpetual. I think that our job, at least my job as a therapist, is to really help couples, one, have a dialogue, which we will talk about, and he talks about solving the solvable problems, which is really about dialogue and solution. But I think it's helping them to have a more productive dialogue about the problem. Because I would guess that the people in fact, I know this to be true, the people that he sees probably don't have productive dialogue about these issues. And so I don't think that the perpetual problems, it's that high. I think it's just that couples need to learn some skills in order to solve those problems. So in that way, I think I disagree with his take on that.
And I would tend to agree with you on that in particular, that example that you gave, that is a solvable problem. I think, like you said, the dialogue, and if it seems perpetual, that's because you need the help of a third party. If that feels like a perpetual problem or like one you can't solve yourselves, then I think going to a therapist and learning how to work through that makes it solvable. You need someone to guide you through that conflict, because that's exactly what it is. It's a conflict, and you need a third party to mediate that conflict.
And here, this is what he says about that particular example and the reason he labeled it perpetual. This is just part of what he says. This means, this is about Ingrid and Gary. This means that they aren't having difficulty communicating about a certain issue. They are having difficulty communicating about how to communicate, which I agree. That to me is a very solvable problem.
Yes.
And so you need most of what I do, I think, is helping couples to have a different communication style. So I can't, like, even today, I mean, my first couple that I saw, it was all about this. And the gentleman became teary at the point and he said, I wish that I would have learned this. They've been married 20 years. I wish I would have learned this 20 years ago. I can see how he would want that. But what he is acknowledging is, yeah, I can learn how to do this.
Yeah.
So that's the reason I disagree with that high number. I don't think it's quite that many perpetual problems. Here's where I think it would be a perpetual problem, but I think eventually you can have acceptance. So the one that comes up is, I want another child, and my partner doesn't want another child. There is no compromise there. Yep. You don't have half a child. You either have one or you don't. Now, the way to solve that, and I have certainly said this to people before, that sometimes because it's something, in this case, having a child is so important to our partner, we give them a gift. But you have to give them the gift freely, and without resentment. And if you can give them that gift freely and without resentment, then you have a solution. But sometimes, neither one is going to budge. And then you truly have a perpetual problem. It's not a solvable problem. So there are certain problems where I think there is no compromise.
I would tend to agree with that. So when Curtis first got his job working remote years ago, he decided that he wanted to move to Indiana, and he had all of these valid reasons that he wanted to move to Indiana. And I didn't like the idea, but, I considered it and I got on board with it and I agreed to go. But, what would happen if I never did? That would be a perpetual problem where he really wants to move to Indiana. I really don't. And, thankfully it wasn't a problem. But to me, that seems perpetual because there's no solution. I mean,
the risk in the relationship is that, say he wanted that, you didn't, he might become resentful. I mean, I suppose in the true spirit of compromise, you could go halfway between Salt Lake and Indiana. I don't know where that is.
I don't know either.
Neither one of you would have been happy then.
No, that just sounds like a lose-lose situation.
So I agree with you. There are certain situations that are unsolvable.
Right. And, in fact, we almost fell into the unsolvable problem of me being extremely bitter and resentful about moving out here. In fact, for a while I was, and it was the only time that we've had genuine conflict in our marriage was about within the first year of moving out to Indiana. I started to become really bitter about it, and I started to resent him. Even though I made this choice willingly, I resented him because he was the one that wanted this. And it was something I had to work through. And what it came down to is I had to recognize that, for one, I was a willing participant. He didn't have to coerce me or he didn't have to talk me into this. I agreed to this readily. And two, there are a lot of positives, and that's really what it came down to. And I think that's really what a lot of conflict comes down to, is you're dwelling too much on the negative. And that's what I was doing.
And you have to shift your perspective. Yes. That's all you did, is you shifted. I call it shifting your gaze. You shifted your gaze from the negative to the positive, and often that makes all the difference. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So I do want to acknowledge one thing in Mark's edition, and I would guess that you have probably one of the very early editions.
I probably do, yeah.
There is a section where he talks about the problem with pornography, and I want to acknowledge that it was in the edition that I read. It's not in Mark's edition, and we discovered this tonight, actually. And so we're not going to touch on this subject at all because we're actually planning to do an entire episode about that in the future. But I wanted to acknowledge that it is there, it is important, and we're going to come back to that. So moving on to gridlock and overcoming gridlock, and to me, these principles almost seem more or less the same. I guess maybe he's talking about those unsolvable problems would be my guess, where, for example, you want to have another baby and one partner doesn't. How do you overcome that gridlock? And
pretty much gridlock. That's the definition of it.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that is definitely gridlock. And I think one thing that we've talked a lot about and that I think is going to be important in these situations is validation and empathy. And
Yes.
and that worked really well for Curtis and I when I was feeling all of this resentment towards him about moving out here. I part of the reason why I got stuck in it for so long is because he was afraid to validate my emotions of missing living in Utah because he felt like he would be agreeing with me when really I just needed him to understand the hurt, the loss and the pain I was feeling. And so when he could finally validate that, it was really healing for me. And so I think that's really important for all couples.
Right. So there's a chapter on solve your solvable problems and gridlock, I think these two go together because I
Yeah.
think it's the same thing. And it's exactly what you are talking about, which, in our episode on communication that we covered. So that idea of, so the three steps that I think are important: listen and understand, the validation, and then the empathy. And so if couples really want to solve their problems, they've got to step back and really listen to the other person's perspective. Now, that only works if you're doing that for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't work if it's one-sided. I think the validation requires that you have empathy for the other person's emotional space. So that certainly gets rid of gridlock. I mean, I think that's how you get rid of gridlock, is listening. And gridlock, to me, when I experience couples who I think are gridlocked, it's because they won't listen to each other. They won't see the other person's perspective. And they actually will say that to me in the session, which I kind of point out that, that's not that helpful to say, I'm really not interested in what the other person thinks. That's the problem right there. It's not whatever they're trying to solve, whether they have a baby or not, or whether they moved to Indiana or not. It's the communication. It's how if someone says, I really am not interested in what the other person is thinking, then you're stuck. That is true gridlock. So
Yeah.
I think, if you use those steps in the communication and you go, then once you truly understand the other person, you move to solution, it makes, having a compromise so much easier.
Mm-hmm. Or at least it makes being comfortable with the overall decision because no matter what, in these instances, a decision has to be made.
Right.
I mean, either you have the baby or you don't. Either you move to another state or you don't. And
Mm-hmm.
part of getting to that decision and both of you being comfortable is you really have to put yourself in that other person's emotional space.
Yeah.
That's very important. So, and for example, let's say Curtis and I had disagreed. It would be very important for me to understand what is so important about Indiana. Why does he want to go and to try to genuinely understand that? And he would need to do the vice versa for me about
Yeah.
staying in Utah. That's critical.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So it's all about communication. I just had this thought that I want to throw out there. Sometimes couples will say, well, let's just not make a decision now.
Hmm.
When you say that, you're actually making a decision.
That's true. Yeah.
And so, not making a decision, you have to realize that for a lot of couples, they'll go on for years not making a decision. Well, you've made a decision essentially. So, I think it is healthier and it's better for the relationship to make the concrete choice, yes or no.
Or even if it's maybe if you're too riled up about it, to give yourself a determined timeline. Say, okay,
Yeah.
let's pencil this for 6 months and come back and talk about it. Or it doesn't have to be 6 months. Let's put this topic away for a month and come back and reevaluate.
Right. But you could also say, depending on the problem, you could say, okay, for right now, we're deciding no.
Hmm.
Let's revisit this in a year and see
Yeah.
where we are.
Yep.
Depending on the issue, you can always say, let's come back and do this process again. So it's
Hmm.
not that you can't change your mind or that the context of your lives change. It changes. I mean, we live in a dynamic world. And so it's changing all the time. And so to say, let's make this decision now, this one, and then let's agree to come back to it.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so let's move on to principle number 7. And real quick, I just want to clear up so no one's confused. Principle 5 was solve your solvable problems, and principle 6 was overcoming gridlock.
Yeah.
Just
And
so
I think they go together. Maybe
I
he
agree.
wanted that nice number of 7, I guess, on number. So he split them up.
Yeah, maybe, but they seem pretty interchangeable to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so principle 7, create shared meaning. And this seems to tie in very nicely at the end. And I think it can also kind of relate back to love maps a little
Yeah.
bit
Yeah.
as well. So, create shared meaning. To me, this makes me think of tradition. And my family has this really fun, silly little tradition that we all really love. And we're a religious family. And so every night before we go to bed, we read our scriptures and we say a prayer with our kids. And even my 2-year-old, he knows that after we read our scriptures, we do a family hug. And it's just this fun, silly little thing that creates shared meaning as a family. We know that we're going to do this big family group hug, and it ends in tickles and laughs, and it's fun. And things like that are important. Traditions are important. Traditions are great at keeping marriage and relationships strong.
Right. And he would call that a ritual, which is,
Mhm.
I think the rituals are really important. Now, this section, I hope it's the same as in your edition. It reminds me a lot of those 270 something questions in Robin Smith's Lies at the Altar,
Okay.
because there are shared meaning questionnaire, which I think couples ought to do. But they go through different areas like your roles, what are your rituals of connection. For instance, I'll just read one. When I become sick, I feel taken care of and loved by my spouse. That seems simple. Like you would assume, okay, people are going to take care of each other when they're sick. That doesn't always happen.
Mhm.
For instance, we share many similar values in our roles as husband and wife. See, these are a lot of questions that I think you probably should ask before you get married, or at least, explore. He
Mhm.
has a section on goals and symbols. We see eye to eye on what home means. These are questions that are reminiscent to me of Robin Smith book, and I think they're both
Mhm.
good. We have similar values about the significance of adventure. So again, in all the chapters, I like the exercises that he has a lot. And I think this one is important. And just the idea, if we think about creating ritual, like for instance, he says that it's really important how we leave in the morning and how we come back at night.
Mhm.
And you're describing that with your children, right?
Yeah.
You have this ritual, it's that ritual of connection. And so
Mhm.
people, couples that I see, there are these traits that stand out in couples that are having difficulties. And one of those traits is they just get up and leave in the morning. They don't say anything. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm going to leave you for 8 hours. And then when they come in, I hear this all the time. They come back from work and they don't acknowledge each other, or there isn't some way to greet each other. Now, I don't know what that is. He would say, go up and hug and kiss, count to 10 while you're
Mhm.
kissing. He would say that we don't kiss long enough, and which I think is probably true. But again, whatever that ritual of leaving and coming back together is, it's important. Now, the other one that I think is really critical, holidays.
Yeah.
And how we celebrate holidays, because that's the tradition. Now, you mentioned, having a tradition like a nightly tradition, and those are really important.
Mhm.
I think what we do around holidays with family is critical, and that is often an area where there can be some conflict. And I
Yes.
think that the reason for that is that, again, we come from two different families of origin, and typically the way we either celebrated a holiday or the significance of that holiday is likely to be
Mhm.
different. And you just have to expect that. And so early on in the relationship or even pre-marriage, I think it would be important to say, okay, if you're a family that celebrates Christmas, then you talk about, okay, what does that look like to us? If you're a family that celebrates Hanukkah, then you decide, what does that look like? And so you create, you as a couple, your own shared meaning in that particular holiday. And I do like just this idea of really being intentional about it.
Mhm.
I think too many couples go into marriage and they aren't intentional about creating these types of things. And it takes dialogue. So, to talk about it, say, what are we going to do about this holiday? What do you want to do about birthdays? It might be surprising to you how some people don't think in celebrating birthdays is important, which is fine. That would be fine if you had both people in the marriage who didn't want to celebrate the birthday. But then when you have children, that
Mhm.
becomes a real issue because all their friends are having birthday parties. So you have to think about these things. You can't just let it go. You have
Yeah.
to be intentional about it.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to holidays real quick, I just wanted to mention that we talk about this at length about conflict around holidays in an episode titled Setting Boundaries, and that's in
Mhm.
mid-November. And so I just wanted to put that out there for listeners because that can be a real big problem. So, as far as setting those traditions, and I think what you said about these questions, or they all come back to Robin Smith's lies at the altar. I think it's important to talk about these very early on in the relationship. I think it's important to know these things beforehand. And, no matter what, you need to agree about it. Curtis and I have this funny thing where we gave up early on in surprising each other with gifts for Christmas and birthdays. I was talking to my mom one time and we're like, "Oh, we're out Christmas shopping." And she's like, "For who?" And I'm like, "Ourselves." And she's like, "You're Christmas shopping for yourselves? Like, where's the fun in that?" And I was like, "Mom, I buy and wrap my own Christmas gifts. It really doesn't matter to us. It's all for the kids anyways, but it works for us."
Right. And that's the important thing is I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong way to do this. It's just
Exactly.
you've got to be on the same page
Yep.
and you have to address it because I'll reiterate this that often a couple they get married, they don't have children, and whatever they're doing feels fine.
Mhm.
And this can be about religion too. What
Yes.
religion? So I would throw that into the area of tradition or
Yeah.
ritual. And
Mhm.
so as soon as children come along, then one or maybe both of you are going to say, okay, how do we raise these children? That's a little late, I think, in my book to
Yes.
decide that. I think that once you become pregnant or even when you get married, you ought to, before you're pregnant or before you have children, you ought to be talking about this because
Mhm.
otherwise it becomes much more difficult, I think, to step back and listen with that validation and empathy to the other
Yeah.
person. This is a mistake couples make. Anticipate the difference that children will make in your relationship and talk about some decisions that you can make now before the children come. It will
Mhm.
save you a lot of heartache.
Yes, I agree. So maybe this is a bit of an aside, but you know what holiday I was hung up on for a really long time?
I'm
Was
hung
Val
up in what way?
Mixed emotions about it. It's Valentine's Day.
What
Because
what were your mixed emotions?
so on the one hand, I am a hopeless romantic and I love cheesy romantic gestures and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, it's a Hallmark holiday, literally just an excuse for stores to jack up the prices of chocolates and flowers. And it's like I don't need one day to show my husband that I how much I love him. I try to do that every day. And so here's the solution I came up with. We made it about the family. And so our family tradition is on Valentine's Day, we go out for ice cream.
Which is a great tradition. And
Yes.
that's a great way to celebrate it. But I think there are many couples where that is an important holiday.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that,
No.
if that is the only day of the year where you're showing love and appreciation for your partner, that's a problem.
Mhm.
But if you want to make it a special day, but for us now as grandparents, I mean, where were we? I think we were in Mexico this year when we celebrated Valentine's Day, and it was nice, and to do something different. We really focus on the grandkids, though, and that's one thing that we do in our tradition. When you were here, did you know the bakery? It's called Mrs. Backer's.
Mm-mm.
Did you ever heard of? So it's on South Temple, and they're an old bakery, and they make these great sugar cookies. So every year we get a sugar cookie in a heart with the name of all our kids and grandkids
Oh,
on
fun.
that. That's a tradition that we do.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to the dialogue. And maybe part of it is I didn't set the precedent early on in our marriage that Valentine's was important to me because I think it might have been. But,
Mhm.
as time has gone on, I just struggled getting into it. I really just struggled with, I guess, the materialisticness of the holiday. And but I really like what we've come up with is we make it a day about the family because in the long term, that's what matters most to me is my family.
Yeah, but I think that struggling with that materialistic view is true for a lot of holidays.
Yeah,
We
that's
live
true.
in a capitalist society, and so
Yes.
it's all about purchasing something. And but I think that you can really move away from that
Oh, yeah.
and make it about something else. But again, the five love languages, which we talked about before,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I agree with this one, but he says one of those is gifts, and receiving gifts or giving gifts
Mm-hmm.
is one of those five love languages. And for some people, that's really true.
Yes.
And so you need to know that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I just think that the gifts, you've got to know that so that you then don't forget that that is a priority on some of these holidays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's my mom's love language is gift giving. It's important to her, gift giving. And I think it's more about the gift being thoughtful
Right.
is really what it comes down to. And one thing I think is worth mentioning with the love languages is they change. Make sure you're
Yeah.
doing
Sure.
that. Make sure you're taking that quiz. If you do that in your marriage, do it regularly because Curtis and I have taken it a handful of times and it has shifted a lot over the years. And this is true for so many couples. And I think the biggest shift that happens, and this isn't going to surprise anyone, the biggest time that it shifts is when you have kids, is when your
Yeah.
love language tends to shift,
Yeah.
particularly for women. Physical touch used to be my very, very, very most dominant love language.
I
And
think I know
I
what you're going to say. Now you've got kids touching you all day long.
And that is true for so many women. And it is still my dominant love language. It has very different meaning now. And I think that's important to talk about, and to have that dialogue. And, it's shifted for Curtis too. And so I think that you need to go back to things like that and really talk openly about shared meaning.
Yeah, I agree with that, that they do shift over time. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So the last exercise, at least in my book, is on symbols. And I think that symbolism is really important. And we may not, really think about the role of symbolism in our lives, but it's there. It's always there.
Hmm.
And so here are some of the symbols that he talks about. What symbols, such as photos or objects, show who our family is in the world, what we value being? So one of the things that we have in our home, have you seen those electronic photo machines?
Yes.
I don't know. Anyway, it's a photo frame, right?
Hmm.
We have it in the kitchen. I don't know, it's probably got 6,000 photos on it right now.
Hmm.
And so the grandkids, people know I have my grandkids twice a week and they have dinner with us at least twice a week. And it's in a place that they can see. And they are always picking out the photos of the trips. And so family trips that we take with them are really important.
Hmm.
And they're always looking at this photo frame.
Yeah.
And so what happens is it's creating this, well, it's a shared value, but it's creating a shared meaning between the grandkids and between all of us, because often these trips are ones that we've taken all together. So family stories are important, and how we pass on the traditions or the stories to our children. And again, you have to be intentional about that. You have
Yeah.
to be comfortable enough with your own family of origin or your own previous life that you can tell the stories to your kids, because it's really important for them to know who you are and where you come from. And so that, as a couple, should be a shared value. What does home mean to you? What do you want out of the home? And again, as a couple, it may not seem important because you're existing, you're in love, life is easy. It changes when you have children, though.
Yep.
You want to be more direct about what kind of environment do we want to create for these children so that, they feel love, they feel acceptance, they feel connection. And I think a lot of that is how we keep our home. And so it's about dialogue.
I agree. And two things that I thought of as you were talking about this is one, you talked about the family trip with your grandkids and how
Mhm.
they always look for those pictures. Family trips do not have to be some big elaborate thing.
No,
Because that can be expensive, right? I mean,
right.
even a day trip to a local park to go on a hike. And in Utah, there are tons of places to hike.
Yeah.
That can be a fantastic family day trip that they will always remember and cherish. And another thing that came to mind about home and how you define home, make family dinners a priority.
Yes. Yes.
So many people don't do that anymore, and that is a lost value that I think needs to come back. And not that it has to even happen every day, because it certainly doesn't happen every single day at my house, just for one reason or another, we are eating on different time schedules. But the fact is that you're regularly sitting down as a family, you're eating a meal, and you're talking.
Yes. And so this is a very old, I don't know if you'd call it a study or a survey, and I think it happened up in Washington State, where they were looking at at-risk youth. And what is the biggest difference between, youth that they would categorize as at risk, like that would mean for drug use and probably teen pregnancy, things like that, and probably even school truancies, stuff like that. And what's the biggest difference between those adolescents and the ones who don't have that? And what do you think it is?
Family dinner.
Family dinner. So when they try to figure out, well, what's going on, it's exactly what you said, because one, it's a tradition, but you're sitting around together and you're talking. And as parents, what we want to do is, in a subtle way, and maybe sometimes not so subtle way, convey our values to our children. And that's what you want to do. And I think often where it happens is around the dinner table.
Yes.
In conversation. Now, that's certainly hard when the kids are young, but I think if you start it, if you make it a tradition, then it becomes an expectation. It's an expectation that you're sitting down to dinner more often than not, with the TV off.
Yes. Electronics.
Electronics in a drawer somewhere.
Yes.
So that you have your undivided attention. And what happens too is you are paying attention to your children, not to the phone. That has great meaning to them.
Yes.
That, oh my gosh, my parents are really listening to me. We're having this meal together. I mean, there's all sorts of symbolism there, right? You need food to stay alive. Somebody's cooked the meal, most likely, and so it's hugely important. I agree with you. I ask that of couples with kids all the time, especially with adolescents. Tell me what you're doing for dinner.
And I think one of the important things about starting it when they're young and setting that precedent then, it's only going to get harder as they get older.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've got 2 kids and we're already involved in sports. And let me tell you, on the days when we have soccer practice, it's very often that we don't sit and eat together as a family, because I have to get one kid eating first so I can get him to practice on time. And then I come home and everyone else has already eaten. And so then I have to eat. And so set that precedent when they're young. And I mean, you're not going to regret it. And I think you're going to find high intrinsic value in that.
I think it's one of the most important family traditions, if you have children, that you can set, because there are so many benefits that come from it.
Yeah. And I mean, in my high school years, we would have, I think, the opportunity just to have a family dinner where all 4 of us kids that lived in the house were there. They were kind of rare just because, we were all so busy and we were all so involved. And so, but even if one person is missing, still do it anyways.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Next week, we are going to move on to a topic that I think is very important. And we're actually going to do this episode with Mark's wife, Lindy Burton, and we'll let her introduce herself next week. So we're going to talk about positive body image, more from the perspective of children. It's going to be a really good episode. It's a really important episode, and we're excited to do it.
And she has a lot more experience than I do, because I don't see adolescent females, and typically it's a female problem, although that's changing.
Yes.
And so she has a lot more experience with this. So I think it'll be a good episode.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. We will see you all next week.
Have a great week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.